Welcome to another episode of Nat Bar Brews. My name is Andy. I'm a beer lover and brewer based here in Cardiff in what's usually sunny Wales, but it's nighttime at the moment, so I can't really claim that. And Nat Bar Brews is the name of my little brewery. It's also the name of this podcast. And it's a podcast that it's about beer, but just a little strange angle on it sometimes. And today's episode is a perfect example of this. And you're probably, well, first thing I've got to say is if you're listening on audio, great. That's kind of what podcasting's for. But you should really watch this episode on YouTube. It's on YouTube. Just search for Nat Brews and watch this, because this is a kind of episode that needs to be visual, because it's about design, about beer bottle design, beer label design, just design and beer. And this is just such a perfect subject for what Nat Brews is all about. And we have a proper good expert on as well. He is someone who knows his stuff. He's a graphic designer, and he lectures in graphic design and leads courses, and he's basically responsible for the next generation of British designers, I think. Would you say that, Ben?
Well, yeah, I think I have some responsibility in that stake. Yeah, absolutely.
He also happens to be a very old friend of mine, and my brother-in-law as well. But that's another story that we could do another podcast about. So Ben Dunning, welcome to Nat Brews. Thanks for coming on.
I'm honoured. Thanks for inviting me.
So yeah, this is a kind of visual episode. If you are listening and you can't watch the YouTube thing, that's fine. We'll describe the bottles as we talk about them. A lot of them you'll know anyway. You can picture them and you can Google them as you go, and it'll work fine. But I think for the full experience, check out the YouTube version, because as you can see, we've got well, I've got a cardboard cutout of a bottle of beer on my screen, and Ben's got a bottle on his screen. And what we're going to do is we'll talk a little bit about beer and design generally, and then we've picked three bottles each that are just interesting to us from a design point of view. And I just want to get Ben's expert explanation really on why these designs have ended up how they are and what that says about beer and design. I think it's going to be a really good chat. Look, let's just kind of get into it. But I always like to check, what are you drinking? Are you drinking something while we chat, Ben? What are you drinking?
I sure am. It's right here for the viewers at
Ooh, looks
home, as it
nice.
were.
That's some red.
Well, interesting. It's not something I've had for a while, except in a pub. But it's another one of the labels I wanted to talk about, or at least use as a starting off point. But it's a Sam Smith Old Brew Pale Ale.
Nice.
So yeah, I not had one in a bottle in quite a while, but when I opened it and took that first swig, I was thinking, this is pretty tasty.
Nice.
So yeah, that's what's
What
accompanying me at
ABV
the
is
moment.
that? Is that like a four and a bit or something? Or
Yeah,
you
four
don't
and a
like
bit.
strong beers, do you? You like to keep it low.
Well, actually, this is a 5%. Generally, I don't go over
Whoa,
5% very often. So
you've
yeah,
changed.
but in a conversation where I was thinking about beer bottles, and I was thinking, oh, what should I talk about? But I'll come back to that one later. But there was a thought process behind picking it.
So even the bottle of beer you've chose to drink has a design kind of angle on it. I like that. It's how committed to design you are.
It's every waking minute, Andy.
I am drinking. So I went for a very long run earlier because I'm training for a half marathon, and I did not feel like having an alcoholic beer. So I've got an Erdinger, which I heard, an alcohol-free one, which I heard is really good for recovering after runs, and it has been really good. And I've said this on the podcast before. You know, drinking beer, enjoying beer does not need to be about alcohol. There are brilliant no and low alcohol beers at the moment. If you want to find out more about that, go back to the episode that I did with the founder of Dry Drinker, and we got into all of that and explained why it's really taken a step change forward. But yeah, you can like beer and not drink alcohol. That's absolutely fine. That's something that's changed recently. That's fantastic. So anyway, look, let's get into this. What we're going to do, we've picked three bottles each, and we're going to talk about it. But first, Ben, our history of beer goes back to beer festivals in Yorkshire with members of your family who have a passion for beer, and then just pubs in London. And I said this on a previous episode. I feel really lucky to have grown up in London, where we had Fuller's and Young's just there pumping out decent quality cask beer. Not the same anymore. Young's is gone, but
As
you know
is
we
Fuller's,
didn't
yeah.
realize how lucky we were, did we?
No, I don't think we did. But considering our teenage selves, I think that's and probably most people, we didn't have any sense of the history behind it. We had no sense of the kinds of beers that those two breweries at the time were somewhat protecting or still doing in the face of how the industry was, etc. So yeah, it's one of those things that we probably didn't appreciate it. And yeah, as you've alluded to, both the stories of those breweries have changed in recent years. And that sort of idea of a story is something that I sort of probably will come back to. But yeah, we were fortunate to have that on our doorstep, and their cultures, and there's almost a pun in there, to help us form our tastes overall. Absolutely.
Yeah, and means I definitely credit that to. I mean, look, I am no critic of lager. I'm trying to brew a lager at the moment, but I think that's part of the reason why I was always happy to go beyond just the kind of Carling, Carlsberg, Stella, what was ever on tap at pubs growing up at uni and stuff like that. I always looked out for a proper beer and ale before I even knew anything about it, and I definitely put that down to having those pubs kind of as part of where we grew up. And also Sam Smith's, we drank in there because it was cheap, didn't we? In Soho, that was the cheapest place to drink in central London.
Absolutely, and in Kingston upon Thames as well. A very important Sam Smith pub for me in my formative years. That's just some books above my head, don't worry. But I think there was something it was interesting what you said there, as obviously this episode being about design, that you were primed for the kind of I'm going to go straight in there with sounding like I know what I'm talking about, sort of the visual language surrounding different kinds of beers, as opposed to, say, the branding you necessarily saw on the telly and being advertised, because generally Youngs and for example, and Fuller's weren't being advertised on the telly. These were things there were certain things about it that you were familiar with. So when you went elsewhere, you're primed to think, right, that I'm going to give that a shot. And I'm aware of more things. That wouldn't have been the case for everybody, but I think that's an important thing to, again,
Yeah,
to
and
sort of
their
get into
labels and
early.
branding look different because they look traditional, didn't they? Compared
Well,
to the Carling and Carlsberg, which was kind of, as obviously now you look at a 90s Carlsberg or Carling and it looks very dated, but at the time they were kind of modern graphic design, right?
yeah, absolutely. They were aping as much modern trends as they were harking back to their past. But it was familiarity as well. They would be on the telly. They were the brands that you'd heard of, as opposed to the ones that were above the door frame, saying this is a Fuller's pub or a Young's pub, for example. You knew of them before you walked into the pub, as opposed to you possibly didn't know the
Yes,
other
good point.
brands until you walked into the pub. And then you thought, oh, I might make this, I might try this out or whatever, but so they might have
Even like
got you through the door.
the gold writing on Fuller's pubs, on the signs, it's not just painted on. It's like it's not embossed, but it's like 3D, isn't it? It's like proper. Of the signs on the pub are actually kind of signs that are built rather than just painted. I don't know if you know what I mean, but that's what I remember about Fuller's pubs is they kind of had these very ornate signs with kind of gold leaf, I suppose, on bits of wood. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, it's definitely
But
evocative and definitely different from the feel of modern brands. Yeah. Okay. Right. Look. Design. I'm going to ask you an almost impossible question. Um, now, I used to work. Well, I still work in audio, but I used to work in radio, and I was a radio producer. And people say, "What does a radio producer do?" And I said, "Well, you basically create the environment within which the program can succeed. It's a bit like being a director of a play. Like you've got the script, you've got the actors, but you've got to pull it all together, and it's your vision." Now, what I hope you've got a kind of similarly pithy answer, but like what is design about? Like why is design so important? It's what is design? Like you can basically, I'm asking a big question about design to define it in some way. You can answer it how you like.
Well, I'll do my best. I wish there were pithy answers, and there are amongst people. But I think that what's might be quite good sort of context for what we're talking about today. Obviously, design is that vessel upon which we attribute things to another thing. And a message is communicated to us. So certainly from a graphic design point of view, there are signs and symbols and signatures and various other parts of the way that it looks, the way that the typefaces look, which are constantly communicating at us. And whether or not you care for it or not, or you know whether or not you appreciate quote unquote good design versus just whatever the vernacular is you're imbibing, to give us another pun, this material all the time, and you're making value judgments about it at almost a subconscious level. But yeah, design is a delivery method for a whole bunch of ideas and concepts, and you know the skillful designers and branders and marketers use those messages to try and communicate something about, you know, to their audience, with a hope that they will either respond to it positively, you know, buy this, vote for that, don't cross the road. You know, it's got all of that you know, danger, it's got all of that in it. And yeah, skillful people are manipulating those words and images to try and yeah, communicate something to an audience. That might be as pithy as I'm going to get.
Oh, that's good. I really like that. And I know from talking to you about design in other areas that, you know, I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of, you know, real cornerstones of design, but typeface is one, and use of shapes and color are other ones. They're just like, you know, they're basics. They're part of a key part of the design language, and I think that will come out as we talk about these labels. So I'll start with, we've picked three each. I'll start with mine, and I think you're the designer, so I think we should finish on your final choice. And I'm sure you've got something kind of great lined up for us, but or maybe you just put them in a random order. Who knows?
It's all in a random order.
It's all in a random order. Brilliant. Well, let's
Yeah.
see where we go. That's perfect for the vibe of this podcast. But I wanted, ever since we came up with the idea for this episode, I wanted to talk to you about one beer in particular, and that's Bass, because it is famously the first ever trademark. It has the simplest logo you could have. It's a red triangle, and it's so instantly recognizable. I have a cardboard cutout of it here because it's weirdly hard to get hold of Bass. I mean, I think Asda stock it. I wasn't able to get to Asda and get one. I do like Bass. I think it's a nice beer, and it's obviously so full of tradition. I mean, I know, you know, it's been bought out and changed and whatever. At least it still exists. So talk us through, and I've got it here. So obviously, I think anyone listening knows what a Bass bottle looks like. It's a dark brown bottle, dark brown beer that gives it. It's quite a dark brown glass, so I don't think you're seeing the color of the beer through the bottle. I think that's the color of the bottle, but it's got that distinctive red triangle on a black background, and the kind of italicized kind of gold writing of Bass. So, and it puts on the label trademark number one as well. So give us some design analysis of Bass as a label and a brand.
Well, I think maybe a better description of the way that Bass is written on it currently is more cursive. So it has that handwriting feel to it.
That's what we want.
That might be a more applicable terminology. But I think I'm going to use that word vessel again. I'm going to use that question, or I'm going to use the first bottle and Bass to sort of as a way of talking about other things as we talk about other to address all the other bottles we're going to have a look at. I think, you know, it's the apocryphal story though that there was the guy before, just after the Trademark Act in the late 19th century was made into law, ready to jump in and get Bass as the first trademark. And I think it's irrelevant whether it's true or not, but it's a story that people who spend any time going, oh, what's the story behind it, will have read that it's got this connection, and you alluded to it already. And in fact, a few years back, I think it was the owners of the brand, which I think is InBev, decided that they were going to put trademark number one on its label.
So that's a recent addition, is it? I did wonder that.
Yeah, well, from my cramming before this to sort of remind myself of the stories around it.
I love that you've done revision. That's brilliant.
Oh, absolutely. Any good academic would make sure that they'd made sure they'd read the sources before they tried to
Love it.
pontificate. So I think that actually phrasing it as that, I mean, it's not that it's not true in the sense that it is one, possibly the very first trademark that was legal under that act. But I think the idea, the story of Bass is older. It's not that the logo was new at that point. It's not that maybe the phrasing and the combination to get that trademark was, but ultimately that arrange, the words and that image together were trademarked at a particular time, but they existed for a period before that. What I find interesting about, in a broader sense about the Bass Triangle, is that it, and as a brand, it was the sort of Coca-Cola of its age, that it had an international reach. You could find it everywhere. And this leads me on to my sort of maybe the theme of this, that brands, if we away from the sort of formal qualities of it, because ultimately there's not much going on here apart from there being a red triangle. That there's other designs can be much more complicated and fussy, etc. But this is bum, but bang, it's just that triangle and that's it.
Simple. Yeah.
It's simple, and that's probably in a sense self-explanatory. We need something straightforward, recognizable, really simple, a red triangle. Boom, it's done. You're not asking people to invest too much to remember what it looks like, because like people are likely to feel familiar with triangles. But it's really the story, and I think in a sense it's again, you sort of started about talking about it. There's this decline that has occurred with the brand over the time in terms of they've got massive awareness of it, but they can't necessarily buy it. It's gone through different owners. It's not brewed necessarily in the same place. And I think that this is a sad tale about actually the way that design is used, or the sort of the legal frameworks about trademarks and all that is not necessarily always a good answer. As a designer, I want design to be a positive force for whoever's selling a product, selling a message, etc., and it to be a good thing. But ultimately, that current iteration of the Bass bottle hides a multitude of sins ultimately of its history. It tells a longer story than simply this is a good beer, and maybe it should be just saying this is just a really good beer, and you should drink it, because
is it evoking false tradition in a way, kind of being a bit pulling the wool over our eyes a bit?
Well, absolutely. Within that triangle, obviously, it's harking back to it featuring in the famous painting that is it Manet, or that sort of gives it that
history. There's a Bass bottle in a Manet, is there?
Yeah. Oh gosh, I was reading it again earlier, but there is a painting in which the red triangle features in a bar, which I think dates from prior to it actually being trademarked. But I may have misremembered that.
And will the design be like? It's part of the reason why the design's so simple, in that it's so old that they obviously didn't have like computer aided design, and it was like I don't know how it would work back in those days, but to even print, I think I remember reading at some point that even to print color on a label at that point was so hit and miss that you needed something so simple like a triangle. Even just a two-color thing and a triangle was a big investment. So is that part of the reason you think why they had to keep it so simple?
Oh, well, I think certainly it's true, and printing in color was more expensive than printing in black and white. It's not that people didn't do that, but it adds a sense of luxury, etc., and to it, and it would have been a more luxurious thing to print lots of things in color. But having things in two color was cheaper than having things in more colors, etc. You obviously you could. I think it'd be wrong to say that it's a triangle because that's an easy shape to draw or construct or whatever. There are incredibly complex bits of printing and throughout history and carving, etc. But I think it's actually the recognizability of it, and that's what I mean about it being in that painting. That whether or not you could read the word Bass, a red triangle at a bar says Bass, and it's the recognizability of it, the recall, that is the important thing there. And having a bold color like red whether or not that's inspired necessarily by the inks or printing processes available, it stands out, it's recognizable. And I think that's almost certainly more of the thinking behind it than maybe the manufacturing processes. But that shouldn't be discounted. They clearly, are it's a sort of a truism in design that the tools that we have to make things are going to dictate how they're going to end up. The writing tools we use, etc., dictate how writing looks, that it dictates how type looks, etc. So or influential. I'm really conscious that as this is a public, that lots of people listen to go, well, maybe he's not saying that quite right. So I'm talking in broadest terms, but our tools shape the way that things look design wise.
I know we have millions of listeners, but tens. But yeah, I'm sure they'll be fine. Look, we should move on because otherwise we're never going to get through these beers. But that was a fascinating analysis.
So it's about story.
Good. Right. Next one is your choice. And is it the one that we can see now, the kernel?
Yeah, well, I thought I'd start with that because I think I'd used it with you as an example before, because I want, home brewing is the reason this podcast exists in terms of and your background. And I remember us talking about the way that you were labeling the beers that you did, and that you described how you've got a brown bottle with just a squiggle of writing on it, not even on a label, but it's a glass.
I used to do labels. I don't know if you remember, but I did like white postage labels, like you'd put on a letter, those stickers. And then I had a press, like the librarians used to have at school that would have the date on it, except I had one that you could put letters on that actually we used for our wedding invites. And I still had it. And I used to painstakingly put all the letters. I mean, this is doing typesetting, right? This is like how they used to make newspapers a little bit. And I took real care. But anyway, there's just not enough time to do that. But it did look like quite cool. We should say, by the way, if you can't see what we're talking about, the Kernel is a brewery. It's a London brewery, I think. And
South London, yeah.
Yeah, and its labels are very simple. So it's got it almost looks like brown parcel tape or paper tape, brown paper. But it's in quite a thin band across the bottle, and then it's just got very simple black writing, which Ben will be able to describe better. But you can Google it or hopefully watch it on YouTube. But that's the vibe. It's very simple. It's very kind of dressed down.
Well, you were doing a very good job of describing it, and I think that's exactly when you were describing it. And you had I do remember those older labels where it was sort of almost like not a pricing gun, but I know exactly what you mean. You were just very simply labeling it on a very simple label. And this is why I'm using this, because what this has an absence really of a heritage from a longer period of time, and it's trying to say something a bit different, and it's trying to say we are different, and it's probably trying to say, and I'm sure the brewers could add to this, but to me it's saying, well, what's important to us is the beer, and that's our priority, and we're just going to communicate in the clearest style to you that this is the beer. So essentially all of their labels, as you described, it's quite a thin band, maybe about 1.5 inches in height, towards the top of the bottle. It just has the name of the brewery, and in small letters it's saying it's in London to remind us, and then the kind of beer just underneath it. And it goes for very some sort of simple graphic design tricks of hierarchy. So the name of the brewery is the largest thing there, so you recognize it's being the Kernel. So if you like Kernel beers, you're thinking, oh right, it's the Kernel. So if you're not already drawn out by the very pared back bottle, brown parcel tape type label, then you see the Kernel. So it's clear with a very few items, in fact, just like that, that we are instantly knowing or recognizing it as a particular brand. And I think if you see it in a fridge in a pub, or you see it in a shop selling bottles, it stands out on the shelf massively. It absolutely does stand out, despite the fact it's not anti-design, but it's got the minimal amount of design it could possibly get away with and still be identifiable. And that says a lot. I say that the message it sends me, and I think this is what I mean about what I picked. I think one of the interesting things about design is a designer can set out, a marketer can set out, a brander can set out with this is the values that we want people to understand, and they could broadly convey that. But once it's out in the wild, what people read into it is what society reads into it. And to bring it back to Bass very slightly, it's that sense that we all have those histories, and we're bringing something to it. So it's always a two-way street at the very least. It's not simply a case of we're being manipulated all the time. We're attributing stuff back to it. So I look at this and I think their priority is telling me what it is, make it very clear, and that we are not like other breweries and we are not like other beer, and beer is really important to us.
Yeah, I love that point. I hadn't thought of that. It's brilliant how you're explaining this. That message is, and it's subtle. You don't realize you're being told it, but you're being told the beer is the most important thing, not the label. And I never thought of it that way. And actually, it's incredibly brave to do what they've done with the design choice, because you're giving away a lot of real estate back to the bottle. You know, that window that you've got on the label to communicate. You know, and you see lots of brands do it. They kind of write this kind of fluffy stuff like, you know, enjoy life, drink pure, you know, have fun. You know, there's always these three, and you just think they've just stripped away all of that and gone, this is the name of the brewery, this is the beer, we're from London, let's get on with it. Yeah,
but absolutely, it's an absence of copy. You know, the words we use to sort of describe it, those sort of 3-word slogans, etc. It's you know, it does exactly what it says on the tin to name a well-known phrase. The Ronseal test.
It's the Ronseal of beer.
Absolutely, but even if you said you hadn't thought about it like that, in a sense, it was all the fact that it came to you quite quickly. So well, that makes perfect sense to me, because you can see that straight away. I think it's worth, if we're going to talk about design very quickly, to say, when you said, oh, maybe I could talk about it a little more. I mentioned hierarchy, about the scale of the different bits of type to each other. But it's all sans serif as well, which in its sense suggests modernity. If it had been sorry, I can't remember if I said sans serif. It's sans serif, so it's that kind of modern looking type, or most people's understanding of something looking modern. Whereas if it had been serif with the little feet at the ends of the various different strokes, broadly speaking, that suggests a bit more history behind it. It has that sort of classic feel. I'm talking broad brushstrokes. There are plenty of contemporary serif type faces that can be very modern, but I'm going to say assert the general public, if they see it without the little feet, without that kind of looking classical and looking ye oldie, it says modernity. So we are modern, we're interested in beer, we're not like anything else. The beer is front and center, and that's the real important thing about the way it looks. I mean, it's really good beer, but it's that absence of images. The bottle becomes the image, it's word as image, and it gives you, I'm going to use that word again, a vessel for you to imprint upon it that this is good beer, and that's the values you have about it. And at the same time, we're not shouty about it, we don't have to have anything flashy, we don't have all this kind of stuff. So it's you know, there's a purity maybe to it as well, all that lots of,
which is a key word in brewing. Yeah. And also, they resisted the urge to use Comic Sans, so that's good.
Oh my god, can't have a design discussion without Comic Sans. But
it's fine. I got it in there. I got it in there. Right. Let's.
No beers have got Comic Sans on the labels, but we could be corrected.
Napa Brews can be the first. Right. Guy, I might have to ask you about my typeface and logo. Maybe I'll save that for another episode. Anyway, I'm going to move on to my next beer. So, this is one that I haven't warned you about, but I bought this. Shout out to Pop and Hops on Whitchurch Road in Cardiff, a fantastic place. And I've tweeted about the fact that, you know, those places, we need to use them or lose them. I know it's tough out there at the moment. Everyone hasn't got much money, but these local independent places run by passionate people, if you don't support them, they will go and then you'll miss them. So make the effort to go. And I bought a selection of bottles from their store in the Corp market in Canton, and this is one I went for, and it was absolutely amazing. It's a German Pils. I think it's probably the prototype German Pils, but I saw the label and I thought, I've got to show Ben this. So here we go. Let's get your reaction to this one.
Right. Well, I think this is the best way to do it, that I just have to talk through what I see in my first impressions. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
and that's great. I was slightly distracted as we've got the visual cue about what's your little beer table on the top of it there and what that
I
might
was just
say.
saying, do you know what it is?
It's Grand Theft Auto.
Grand Theft Auto, an old copy from the
I'm sure
Xbox.
alcoholism comes into that somewhere, or possibly. Anyway, we
Oh,
digress.
this is real. This is not
Uh,
telly. There you go.
this is that.
Right.
Is
So
as it's
balancing on
happening.
Grand Theft Auto Ancient Xbox One Edition is this Rothhaus pills. The label is all in German, which is always a good sign. They haven't even. It's been imported without even trying to translate anything. So this is the proper job. So come on, let's throw some design stuff at me.
Well, I think that in itself, I think we got to actually sort of combine the two things here. I can look at that and I can get instant reactions, and I could maybe talk about the way that it looks and feels, which I will do. But if we're talking about branding and the way that things are marketed, and you'll know this, when things come from abroad, from anywhere, they already automatically have some kind of exoticness to them.
Yes.
There's something about it. I think particularly with food and drink stuffs, maybe not with necessarily other things, but if we see it, people are generally, oh, that's interesting, and it's from abroad, it must
Well,
have
like
all
cars
those
as well,
qualities.
like the
Yeah,
glamour associated with like Mercedes and BMW.
absolutely.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
So I think that there's people like that on itself, and clearly there are brands that are sold in the UK that have international heritage. They might be global brands now, etc. But they were sold and are sold upon their foreignness, and I think that's something we might come back to. And I say that it's not as a negative; it's a positive. So the importers of that already have got a kind of this sort of inbuilt advantage of saying, oh well, we're bringing something different and exotic, and for people who are interested in trying something different, they will see all those visual cues, starting first with it being in a language that's maybe not their native tongue, and that is attracting them in there. So let's see, as at Rothaus.
yeah. I better describe this bottle quickly for anyone who's
Well,
listening
if
because
you
this will be a hard one to. You can Google it. So Rothaus is spelled Rothaus and pills obviously Pils. I think if you Google that, I think you'll get to it. So it's got a picture. It's kind of got a label that's got red bands top and bottom, and then the main illustration is of a kind of smiling traditional German woman with trees behind her. But what drew me to it, and why I thought of you is just like the illustration style is so distinctive. It's kind of blocky, like mostly straight lines. It's not trying to be realistic. It's a blocky. I must be a better word than blocky, but it's a kind of blocky representation of a woman with bold colors, thick black lines, and it just leaps off the page to you. And she's holding a couple of beers, and then you've got Rothhaus is in some kind of, I guess, some kind of gothic font. Pills in something that looks a bit kind of 70s ish. So yeah, that's obviously Google it, watch on YouTube to get the full thing, but that gives you a vague idea of it. So sorry, Ben, back to you.
I think you're doing a great job of describing it there, and maybe I will use this in the description or use it to my students and say, look, this is someone who's not schooled in it describing something. Maybe you could take some pointers.
Blocky.
Blocky. But that's your instinct. That's how you're feeling about it. So yeah, there's a hint of the sort of the primary color that you might, if people remember the sort of the Miffy books, Dick
Yes.
Bruner. It's
Yep.
got that kind of blocky blocks of color and simple shapes and forms, roughly speaking, that you might imagine in that, which in my mind does evoke a more sort of continental feel. I think that the illustrative style is trying to hark back to, again, a sort of maybe an older period. I'm not going to sort of nail my feelings to the mast, as it were, about when that might be. There's almost a stained glass feel about it, so I
Yes.
think that's
True.
possibly deliberate in it. And I think maybe another word you might look at is a bit impressionistic, i.e. it's not or maybe abstract would be that,
Yeah.
although it's you can see that there's a tree, and you can see that there's somebody holding steins of a pills lager. It's not going for it being entirely realistic. But that I think that it's historical,
Mm.
that it's trying, you know, it's trying to tie into its heritage, not simply a case of we haven't rebranded this for, you know, decades because we can't be bothered, but more a case of we're tapping into the fact that we've been doing this a long time, we're traditional, and you know, this is a heart, you know, is telling you we are quality in what we do. I think you're sort of having a good stab at trying to describe the type, and the way that I would, I mean, I think there's certainly some gothicness to it, or at least how people might think of gothicness. There's maybe another way would be like black letter. If people go through their font lists, if they happen to have it, and they might find something that says black letter, and they get that a bit of how the Roth House looks. But just again for listeners, and what that sort of represents as well, again, is there's a history behind it. And because you mentioned about type and typefaces being an integral part of graphic design, absolutely, and a key part of what we do and talk about and use or design, is that those shapes that make those letter forms are are very inspired by the handwriting strokes. So those you know, wide nibbed ink pens making one stroke, a
Yes.
downstroke, and then hooking back round to get thin strokes to get the sort of the bowls of the letters, etc. And it has this suggestion of handwriting and of craft behind it,
Yep. I
and
get
you
that
know that
totally.
all of that is tying into it. So it might have this kind of maybe a little bit cheesy approach to it on the top, but those are still there in the background. Yeah, and any good designer knows, you know, trying to match your typefaces is an art, and you know, having them strongly contrast is also quite complement but contrast. So you've got something with this yeah, sort of gothicy black letter, um handwriting, you know, calligraphic type across the top, and then you've got something that is certainly feels like it's more of the printing age. So there's this contrast between this is the past, this is the future, here we are. So I would hope that most people walk away from this thinking, I'm going to get a classic German pills for this. This is going to be
Well, it was. It was
yeah,
absolutely beautiful. And am
yeah,
I right in thinking, Ben, that we talked about the impressionistic or kind of non-realist, I called it blocky, the way that it's quite hard. It's a real skill to make that still look like the thing it's meant to represent with such little detail. Like, the tree has literally got one line with three little kinks in, and yet obviously it's green, but it's a tree. And then her face, I mean, I just think it's incredible that they've got it. It's such a small design, but what that is, and it's almost reduced that image down to its kind of bare bones a bit, hasn't it?
yeah. You know, the you raise good points, absolutely, about, you know, how much can we pare something down before we don't recognize it, and those are always interesting questions in design. At what point does something become unreadable, unrecognizable, and at what point do we start to input in some meaning to it? And I think that broadly, and I'm sort of paraphrasing something from a different sphere here, the closer we move away from it being a very literal representation of something, and being very photorealistic, the more we can imprint onto it. So if it's really photorealistic, it's absolutely this thing with these values, or
You
whatever.
don't
And
have to
at the
interpret it;
time,
it's clear.
there's no
Yeah,
interpretation, but the more abstraction that you have, it allows people to imprint themselves on it. If it's a face, for example, and other things can come into that messaging. Yeah, designers also say, oh yeah, you keep it straightforward and a really focused message in your logo, etc., that people can understand it. But that abstraction allows other ideas to be explored. I'm noticing a little bit more now as you've turned the bottle a little bit more. The person is clearly a woman, I think,
yeah.
from that. Yeah. Who's serving you, which feels in itself maybe not a particularly contemporary
It's got an
representation.
Oktoberfest vibe to it,
It's
maybe.
got an October test
Yeah,
vibe. So again, it's sort of harking back to previous, you know, previous eras, etc. But her dress, or when I say dress, I don't mean a literal dress. I mean her outfit,
yeah.
is a one that looks traditional as well.
Mm.
So there's a lot of things in here that are talking about heritage, about where it's come from, and about tradition, and yeah, and that sort of heritage kind of vibe to it, which are contrasted with maybe these kind of brighter, vibrant colors in that Miffy style, maybe an over abstraction, and a contrasting with that, certainly the pills that sort of says something a bit more modern. There's a hint to we are thinking about the future, but really we're rooted in our
Mm.
past.
No, it really
Yeah.
leapt out to me, and like when you're under a bit of time pressure picking beers to buy as we were, and to be honest, I wanted to buy a selection, but this one really leapt out. I think I did pretty much buy this on the strength of the label. I could obviously tell it was a pills, and I thought that's something I'd like to have. So yeah, no, that's been really good. Right, on to your next bottle then,
Right. Well, maybe
or
I'll.
or maybe it's not a bottle.
No.
Oh, here we go.
It
So
is a bottle. We're going to
this
go
is
the
the Sam
bottle.
Smith's Pale
This is the
Ale.
Sam Smith that I have been drinking, and is now finished. But I think we're going to talk about, because obviously I didn't necessarily know about the things that you were going to show beforehand, but some of the stuff that we've touched on with Bass and maybe with the last bottle as well. But
Forgive
I'm just
the noise of my can being opened.
yeah,
Oh, it's got a bit lively.
yeah, I'm
Um,
thinking about opening a can here too. But I think what's the reason I picked this, and I stood in the shop, my local uh, interesting beer supplier. I could plug them if
yeah, do
you're
it. Yeah, of course.
Noble Green in Hampton Hill, which is a very good supplier uh, of interesting beers. But I stood there thinking, what beer, without maybe going too obvious, is definitely trying to keep some of those from a UK perspective, traditional visual language alive. So what we've been looking at is something that feels very German and or Germanic and has that feel about it. Whereas in a sense, I've sort of almost picked this to contrast with the way that the bass that you had looks like. So that the bass, that version of it looks quite different from the way that it would have, how it's looked in the past. But if you're able to look at this label a bit more closely, and if anyone is familiar with bottles of Sam Smith beers, you've got very sort of thin red lines. Again, limited color palette, which goes back to what we were saying previously. That in itself has a connection with history, but there's lots of little details like a sort of outlines or strokes on the outside, what might be called key lines, of a lot of the kind of some of the bits of type, changes in scale, this kind of this banner effect. You've got
Sorry
connections
to
with.
interrupt, Ben. If you want to
So
see this, and you're listening and you want to know what to Google, it's Sam Smith's Pale Ale Organic. I guess you'd want to put in there as
yeah,
well.
that's on the top. Yeah,
Bottle, and it's when it comes up right, it looks. I mean, it looks on my screen. It looks like a very almost a pink label. Is it pink or light red or what is it? It's a
well, it's yeah. To keep describing, it's a black background on the front, which then leads to sort of a kind of a creamy
mm,
color that the sort of badge, as it were, sits upon.
yeah,
And in a sense, the other thing about it, it has that kind of pump clip quality, that it
yes,
has that kind of an oval shape. So there's a connection there to stuff that's on a pump clip, being hand poured. It's got those kind of vibes about it. I've used the word vibes, but that kind of
yeah.
feeling. I think also interestingly, because it's Sam Smiths are for everything else about them are proud of its sort of Yorkshire roots.
Mm.
It's got the white rose at the
Yeah, the
top.
white rose kind of gets pride of place, doesn't it? It's almost
What?
like a crown you would see on anything that is got a royal um charter or whatever it's called when they approve products. It's
Yeah.
like that. They put the crown on top and they put the white rose on top.
So yeah, they are very particular about we're being highlighting where we're from and our heritage. And then obviously it says Tadcaster at the bottom as well. There's lots of type on here. And then it's got sort of just below that what looks awards that it may have won or has won, and type around the outside. But there's a lot of type going on it. So it has, in my view, but I think if people have sort of 19th century playbill kind of
Yeah,
qualities to it,
yeah,
which people will be familiar with. And that a lot of type alludes back to that. But that kind of, we're going to arrange various bits of type at different scales and different sizes, and all together to kind of create these kind of quite complex type-led designs with some patterning around it, some ornamentation around it to sort of add extra visual interest. But I picked it largely because it's definitely going for that UK tradition, that 19th century UK kind of feel about it. Whereas I think that with Bass, it's lost a lot of that, which it
mm,
previously had. And that's
mm.
what I was saying about stories, that in this instance, Sam Smith really want you to make those associations, even if the reverse of it feels incredibly modern, etc. This is kind of like at the
Yeah,
same
it's
time.
like a bottle of two halves, isn't it? Because on the front,
Yeah,
it's completely traditional. Like you can imagine that that is just a reprint of the original label. But I mean, they probably, I don't know how long they've been brewing this particular brew for. Obviously, they wouldn't have been brewing an organic one
yeah.
back in the day. And actually the organic bit does look a bit more modern. But then on the back label, but you can imagine that the front label maybe hasn't changed for maybe even 100 years.
Yeah.
But the back label, they've got a big. Is that a picture of them kind of brewing it? Is that a picture of the fermentation vat or something?
Uh,
Or
yeah, their Yorkshire squares, it says there to ferment their bottled ales at the Sam Smith Tadcaster Brewery. So yes, they've got a photograph on there to again to reinforce this tradition. So I think between the beers, I think this is what is interesting. We've had three beers so far that have very much tradition as part of their way that they want you to consider it through the visual language that they use. And I think that that's really an important thing for any brand, is that it's the stories that they tell. I think we started with Bass, which is a bit of a sad story from something that was the Coca-Cola of its day, and where it is now is a different a different area. Whereas we contrast that with Kernel, which is the antithesis of everything that this looks like,
yeah,
and it's antithesis of what the um, uh, your German pills look like. But that was coming from a different tradition. So we've got something that's been there, done that, got the t-shirt, but is maybe fallen on harder times, and now looks maybe a little bit more generic, despite this incredibly rich history to it. You've got something that is totally wants its modernity and its focus on the craft to be front and center. You've got something that wants us to think about its roots in the continent and its brewing traditions. Now we've got something that visually is trying to tell us something about its UK traditions, and particularly the county in the UK that it comes from. And I talk about this as if this is obvious, but for for your listeners and other people, it might be percolating at the back of our brains, but a lot of this is all happening without us really consciously thinking about it, but we make value judgments on it that we might not even consciously recognize. But all of these things that these bottles are doing are communicating that. And I would add, all of what we've looked at has been in brown glass as well, and they've been
yeah,
bottles, which in
yeah.
itself,
That's about to change.
that is, and actually going back to the kernel very briefly, it's interesting that they could be in cans, which will probably we're coming to, but they've gone for bottles. So there's this interesting contrast between the maybe more traditional bottle and the super modern can as a way of getting across interesting beers or different brands.
Yeah. Right. So talking of cans, I mean, first I should give a shout out to. I don't usually have two beers during a recording, but they are both low and low, so I'll give myself a break. This is very nice. This is Big Drop Brewing Company Pine Trail Pale Ale. It's alcohol free, so and this is not one that I've chosen as a design, but even I could, as you were saying that about choices and simplicity and modernity, and as somebody I am now already of this conversation looking at the beers I drink in a different way. And I was looking at that can and thinking, well, look, it's got a big drop on it, hasn't it? So yeah, they've obviously chosen that, and it makes sense. So, but anyway, we're going to put that to one side because the can that we are going to put, and this will, there will be a lot of beer lovers who may not, who might eyes may burn when they look at the screen here for various reasons. But I think it's a fascinating one. Right, and you actually just suggested that we talk about this, and I thought it was a great
Yeah, yeah.
idea. So here we go. This is a can of Madry, which seems to just be everywhere now. And yeah, it's a 440 can. I mean, I think we all know what a can of Madry looks like, right? But yeah, it's if you want, if you want to like, Google it, by
Who
all means
doesn't know what
Google,
Madry looks like now?
by all means Google can of Madry, or just watch it on the YouTube. But Ben, I'm really looking forward to seeing what you say about this. So give us your best or worst on Madry.
Well, I said, yeah, it'd be nice to talk about Madry because it is a story of branding, absolutely a story of branding. Because this is a beer that um, uh, sounds Spanish. It claims its roots in Spain. You know, if you read the press releases and the commentary, it is a joint venture of some description between a Spanish brewer and a mega brewer in the UK. I think is it Colson Wars? I don't know, but one of the big big players. It's them or InBev again, but
Molson
the
Coors, yeah, you're right. Yep,
Molson Coors. So
brewed and packed in the UK.
yeah, and the thing is that it was always a beer that was going to be brewed and packed and created in the UK. It's a UK lager, but it's the idea just to come back to the German one. So it's kind of really perfect that you sort of picked that one out. It's not imported. It's not hasn't got a Germanic tradition about it at all, but it wants us to think about Spain. It wants us to think about being on holiday. It wants us to think about warmth and maybe that a Mediterranean kind of lifestyle, etc. And you know, they played a very good game of how they've released this. So it's not just about the design here, but and I think this is an important point. One of the books that I've got stacking up my beers when they for the viewers at home is a book on brands by a chap called Wally Ollins, which is one of those kind of required reading books. But brands are, and to come back to it, stories, and what they've managed to create is a story and a feeling without any of that history, and people are bought into it 100%, even if it's a fairly generic lager. I'm not down on it. I've had a couple. It's fine,
No,
but
you
it's
know what? There is a time and place for a Madry, and I think
yeah,
it's clever that it's 4.6%, which is taste premium. I always
yeah,
when they launched this, I thought, well, they're just putting a competitor to San Miguel. Now I love a San Miguel, but it's strong. It's 5%, and this is a bit. I know it's only 0.4%, but it makes it there. In fact, I think even San Miguel might be more than 5%. I don't know. Anyway, it's around that mark. And this is more drinkable, but it has that kind of premium taste, and it does taste good cold on a warm day. I'm not knocking it. I've always said this on the podcast. I'm not a beer snob. You enjoy a Madry, go enjoy a Madry. But I think the design story you're telling is fascinating in that you look at it, and I remember I remember seeing the beer appear in, I think I was a golf club, and I suddenly saw it, and I thought, oh, I've not heard of that before, and I had one. Um, and it appeared in pubs before it was advertised, and that's interesting as well, especially with the branding, because you're kind of inviting the drinkers to you're obviously confident of the taste at that point, because you're like, well, let's just get it in the pubs and let it speak for itself.
well, I think that again, that's really good observations. That and it kind of almost back to our beginning conversation about our relationship with brewers like Fuller's or Young's from the pubs. That there were beers you've heard of before you walked into the pub, and then there's the beers you recognized when you started going in the pubs, and they've gone for that way around of like, well, oh, it's available in the pub. It's got something about it which means we can't get it in a bottle, but only in the pub. It's clever. I'm not, just like you're saying about not being a beer snob about it. I'm not gonna knock the marketeers and the sort of the branding consultants behind it for how well a job they've done at doing that. But there's one thing that it's to pick up on, and I'm not going to claim that this is a unique thought to me. But you mentioned San Miguel, but the kind of there being a man on the front who's got maybe a bit of traditional dress has more of a beer Moretti kind of
That's
feel
true.
to it.
That is true. It is like the kind of it's like the ITV to the BBC of Moretti, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure I'd use either of those as the comparators, but certainly, yeah, they are. I think that from Madry's point of view is an entirely intentional visual
Yeah.
connection.
Yeah, I've not
People
realised
are
that.
and more
Great
for
point.
me, Moretti's had, a longer period. It does have a history behind it, even if again it's part of a mega brewing conglomerate. But it does have a history behind it, and it comes from a longer tradition. And the way that they've designed this is to try and tap in again to those things that are in the back of people's heads, and then you're making these connections without yourself necessarily realizing it, because you might have thought, I quite like that Italian lager. Again, potentially it's brewed in the UK under license or
Almost
whatever.
certainly. And
But
begins with an M and ends in an I, which I hadn't even realized up till now.
yeah, I was going to say that I think that's a happy coincidence, but also when someone landed on it, they got this man. Oh, and it does that. Somebody somewhere would have thought that and thought that's a good thing.
And it's
I,
Madrid with the D taken off. So, they really are ramming the Spanish thing down your throat, aren't
oh,
they? Like, we
absolutely.
get
But
it, it's a Spanish beer. Except it's not. It's brewed in the UK. But
absolutely. Well,
yeah,
the type as well, if you imagine sort of walking around Madrid or Spanish towns and looking above some more traditional
yeah.
shops and cafes and bars, it's just the kind of type that you might see, or at least it has hints at it. So within the typeface, there are these subtle hints to the observer of a place, of a time. And yeah, I just wanted to sort of, because it's obviously very common at the moment, and they've done a very good job at bringing it out to people. And yeah, I agree. We shouldn't be snobbish about it, but I do think we should respect the fact that how well
A
they've
good
managed to do
marketing
it.
job.
Good
And red
man, I
red and
think.
gold is the Spanish football team, isn't it? And it's got a gold top and
Yeah,
gold is
it's
the kind of alternate color. So
all thought through,
definitely all
and that's why it's been, one of the reasons, or many of the reasons why it's been so successful in launching and getting to, what is it? I don't know, in a top 10 seller beer in the
Oh, it
UK
must
this
be
year.
way. I must be. I mean, it seems everywhere. I don't have the
Yeah,
figures, but it just seems everywhere. Right. Good job on Madry. So I think we're now down to the final beer, which is your choice.
yeah.
This has been such a brilliant thing. I had a suspicion that this was going to be a lot of fun, and it has been. So what? Oh, here we go. I think I know what you've done here. I think you've gone hyper local. So tell us. I will describe this is it's a Jawbone Brewery, which is a small microbrewery in Twickenham, down by the river. Um, I used to live in Twickenham. Ben still lives quite near to Twickenham, and we've been in there. We've had a drink at their little tap room. Great guy, great brewer, fantastic beers, building a really good reputation. So this is, I think, so if you want to Google it, it's Jawbone Bone Idol in a can. It's a pale ale, and if you can't look at it, we'll just describe it. It's got what I would call that kind of classic craft beer, almost airstream can feel to it. So you're seeing the natural metal of the can, or what appears to be the natural metal of the aluminium, shiny aluminium underneath it, and then I guess a kind of a wraparound label that takes up maybe 3/4 of the can, which is dark blue with a kind of pattern on it. Kind of reminds me of the Avalanche's album cover, if you can picture that. And yeah, you've got a hook. Their logo is a hook, and I don't really know how that relates to Jawbone, but it's pretty recognizable. It's definitely evoking the type around it is kind of traces the circular shape of the hook. Yeah, I'm done describing, but that's what it looks like to me. So give us some theory on this, Ben.
Well, again, Andy, I think you're doing a fantastic job of describing here, and I may have to use as a masterclass for how you can talk about stuff without feeling you
Without
quite
knowing anything
know what
about
you're
it.
talking about it. One of the things that you aren't maybe able to see, or viewers aren't see, underneath the hook it says "Born in a Boatyard."
Nice.
So
Okay.
that they do have some copy, in contrast to Kernel, and I think this is important because there is an element of sort of these kind of qualities of word and image going on here. So you described it sort of this kind of abstract background patterning, which had that vibe of that Avalanche's album from the early 2000s. And I was lucky enough to have a conversation with Ben the brewer at Jawbone, and I understood from him that all the labels, certainly for his launch, and I think Bone Idol was sort of his core beer, and as we're able right from the start were that they're actually photographs taken around the industrial estate, which is on the river that his brewery exists in. So they may be abstract, but they are actually pictures of this boatyard and this industrial space,
I
which
did
have
think
just
that could
been
look like
zoomed out.
water kind of shimmering. I don't know if it is, but
It possibly. I don't think it's been treated. I mean, I'm not 100% certain, but I think the fact that you can read that into it is probably partly intentional, but equally a positive interpretation, even if it was unintended, that they would be happy for it to be interpreted. But I think you did a really good job about that sort of the exposure of the can behind it, and that in a sense that was partly the reason I wanted to do it as well, because again it sort of talks about modern breweries or new breweries who are experimental, or they're interested in craft beers which don't have that tradition behind them. And I think that in contrast to maybe a few of the other beers, certainly the Sam Smith's, for example, or Bass, which might be ales or bitters, and we again talking about certain London brewers at the beginning, they have this very much a tradition and certain types of beer styles that they're associated with, whereas these modern upstarts are not those things. They are something else, and they're building their own stories, and the beers that they brew are not necessarily cask beers, or they're not necessarily gravity poured and all that tradition behind it. So they have to create their own stories. And so I think this is important, that Born in the Boatyard, there is a story being built about it, and it's in the branding, because this is where the brewery is. This is and we're using imagery from around that space. I don't know what the story is behind the hook, to be honest, and how that connects to
it's
Jawbone. I wonder if
nautical, isn't it? I guess so.
yeah,
It's something you might see at a boatyard. And I just as you were talking there, I was thinking, I wonder if that born in the boatyard thing, it makes you think, well, I want to see this boatyard. I want to go to it. And he's obviously got the ability there. It's designed into how he uses the space to seat quite a lot of people, and that must be a good source of income and a source. And as I understand, he works on his own, doesn't he? So maybe as a kind
I
of
think so.
source of,
Yeah,
you know, company in a way. I mean, I wonder. I mean, I doubt he thought about it in this amount of detail, but I just wonder if there's an invitation behind that.
very possibly, and maybe one day Ben from Jawbone will
Yeah, like that.
grace
That's
your
nice.
podcast.
I like to have two B's in it. Yeah, and it fit under the hook.
Absolutely. But I think you're right. There's a space, it's industrial, it's got a little story behind it. It's definitely of this kind of new brewers, the way that it's using a can, not a bottle. I mean, there are going to be other reasons which are potentially down to cost and how things are bottled. But at the same time, a good designer works to the limitations, or at least again, a truism in design is, that if you're given a set of confounding boundaries, you have to be more creative within that space. And I think that there's a good job is happening in this, of conveying that, or using those minimum means to be able to get sort of that maximum meaning, to use a phrase which other graphic designers might
Maximum
be.
meaning. That's a good one. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Again,
I might have to call one of my brews maximum meaning.
I have to now shout out. There was a mid 20th century graphic designer called Abram Games, who came up with the sort of maxim of maximum meaning, minimum means, which is a really great sort of summation of
Wow.
how.
Okay.
Yeah,
So kind of
it works
efficiency of design, effectively.
and efficiency in design, but it doesn't prescribe a way of doing something, other than that you are trying to get across a lot of information with the smallest number of variables, I guess, within that. And I think it's a good rule of thumb for a lot of people to think about design. I think what's true of all the things that we've discussed is that none of it's too baroque with too much going on. And even if there is a lot going on, like a bit like the Sam Smiths, it's all in a service to suggest a particular time and a period. It's not there's too much there that the people can't see what's going on. And I think if we're talking about this around for all of the branding of beer, etc., they want to get across their message as quickly as possible. We stand out, we are here, this is what we do, and you want to buy our beer and enjoy our beer in various locations. And yeah, and ultimately I picked it because I want to support local brewing, but I think it tells that it is a good example of that, hyper local, but at the same time we've got a story to tell, and we're doing a good job at telling our little story about it, and allows us to talk about other modern brewers.
And the professionalism, right? Like this is a tiny brewery, and that can, you wouldn't think that that is a tiny brewery. It looks right up there, and this, I guess, is modern technology, both in the design but also in the manufacture. You know, you can get as a small operator, same in podcasting. You know, you can, you know, we're having a go at visualizing this podcast now, and we can do it. You know, 20 years ago, we'd have had to get a film crew or, you know, hired a TV studio to do this. And I think that that local craft and achieving very professional standards with very low budget and probably not huge amounts of kit, well, decent kit, but you can get it all. It's part of the story of modern brewing now, is this. And I think the gap is narrowing between you hear of a lot of home brewers, or certainly a few, that move on to brewing professionally. And I think that's, you know, it's great that small brewers can come up with such professional design that it more than holds its own against the ones we've discussed tonight, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the democratization of all of those things in some ways, and in the broader world that it has its drawbacks as well as its positives. But I think certainly for craft beer, for beer in general, it's a lot easier to actually make stuff, and then to make stuff that has that professional and quality feel about it. And I think that's probably only a positive, certainly within this field. And that accessibility to technologies allows this podcast to happen, and allows these beers to happen. And I 100% agree. You know, this on the shelf easily holds its own against all the other ones in the shops that I go into, and I think, oh, that I'm it's distinctive, it stands out, it's got an identity, it's got a story. And if you go and talk to the brewer, he can explain, like I say, that, you know, that this all came from the place in which he works. I'm just going to use that as one last maybe really good point. I think that if I was kind of sort of defining what's good design versus just versus design that's functional or adequate, is that if you can talk to somebody about the way that something looks, and on the surface they may not have seen things or understood things about it, but then they said, well, you know, the reason we've used this color or that typeface or this picture is because of it's the boatyard I went in the person you have that conversation with, it starts to mean something more. And like, oh, that's really great that you've done that, you know, it's really interesting. So it sparks a conversation. And again, while this might be ignored by most people or never known by most people, those people who then hear it or understand it, or indeed the owners of those brands who think, oh, that's quite clever, I like having that story, as soon as those stories start to emerge, and that can start to worm its way around other people, it adds something to it. And I think if design can spark a conversation, that's its best thing, regardless of whether or not it communicates precisely what it's doing. But sparking conversation is always going to be a benefit to the person who's asked for that design to take place or has used that design.
Yeah, that's a really good point to end on, and it's obviously sparked a conversation here. And you know, I we've talked for a long time just by putting bottles and cans in front of us, because there's so much to talk about. And I think what I've taken from this is that it's another part of beer that you can enjoy. You know, obviously we enjoy the taste, we enjoy the kind of, I guess, the kind of ritual and the social side of it, but and this is maybe something where, you know, if you're not, either if you're with people in a pub or in a microbrewery or something like a tap room, it's another thing for you to talk about, another to start a conversation, as you said, another thing to enjoy about beer. But even if you're on your own and just, you know, want to have a tasty beer and want to enjoy it for what it is, um, you know, look at the label. You know, I think if you've listened to this podcast, you will look at the label and look at the bottle now. You won't be able to help yourself and get a bit more out of it. And if it's adding to the enjoyment of drinking beer, then that's a fantastic thing. So thank you, Ben. Well, do you want to say something back on that?
Just very, very briefly, because it occurred while you were saying that, I think that those conversations and the way that we think about it, and maybe this helps, not helps, or at least sparks thoughts in people's heads. When we look at those designs, we are already thinking about what it might taste like or what it is.
True,
And
so true.
that's a classic with food and drink. So it might actually, for many people, make them enjoy the products even
Yep,
more,
yep.
which can never be a bad thing.
No, that's true. That's true. Well, look, this has been absolutely fascinating, as I hoped and thought it would be. Thank you, Ben, so much for giving your time and your design expertise on this. It's been absolutely brilliant.